Active Directory domain services, there's really no better way to teach you how it's done than to just show you how to do it. So let's go take a look, see how it's done. All right, so to get things started with the installation of Active Directory domain services, let me first explain what computer we're on. And right now I'm on a computer that is named NYDC1. And the reason that the computer has this name is because that is what it's going to become. See, right now it's just a base installation of Windows Server 2012. This is the computer that we actually installed back in the beginning of this course. The reason I'm calling it NYDC1 is because we are now creating an Active Directory infrastructure for our fictional company Globomantics. And with this company, it is headquartered out of New York, so that's where the NY comes from. And it's in that corporate headquarters where we typically would find the beginning of your Active Directory infrastructure. Okay, now there's some terminology that we're going to get to in just a little bit here in the lesson as far as forests and trees and domains and stuff like that. So this would be the beginning of our Active Directory forest. It's in New York, so that's what the NY is for. DC, saying that this is a domain controller. And 1, meaning it's the first domain controller that we are going to create. Now that we've explained all that, let's go ahead and install Active Directory. Now, the first thing to installing Active Directory is understanding that Active Directory Domain Services is a role. And we install roles from the Server Manager. So I'm going to come down here and open up the Server Manager. In the Server Manager, you will see here, and I'll tell you what, I'm going to click on Local Server just to show you quickly how this server has been configured in case you weren't here for that earlier lesson where we set it all up. You'll see that the computer has a name of NYDC1. It's still just part of a work group, right, because no domains actually exist yet. We've turned the firewall off. Again, in production environment, I had mentioned back when we first did this, you wouldn't want to turn it off. You typically want to have it on. But because we're in a learning environment and we want to make sure that the firewall is not getting in our way, we're going to go ahead and have it off. Both remote management and remote desktop are enabled. And I will take this a step further and I will tell you that I am connected to this computer right now via remote desktop. Okay, this is a remote desktop connection that I have running right now into NYDC1. You'll see I have a static IP address of 192.168.10.201. And I don't know that any of this really matters for what we're doing, but I will point out that Windows Update has been configured to update automatically. We're not doing error reporting or customer experience. We've turned off IE Enhanced Security. Again, only because it's a learning environment, and the time zone has been set for New York. All right, back to the dashboard. On the dashboard, you'll see there's a link here for Add Roles and Features. When I click on that link, it takes me into the Add Roles and Features wizard. In this wizard, the first screen that comes up is one that you can eliminate for all future installations, right? We can skip this page by default going forward. And in fact, I'm going to check that box because I don't need to see this page after this first time. But really what it's showing you here is it's just a before you begin page telling you that there are 3 very significant things that you should really look out for before you install any role or feature. And that is the administrator account should have a strong password. Because once we install a role, we are now taking this computer from its very basic, kind of bare bones, no real purpose in life condition and giving it a purpose. And along with that purpose also means that you're creating a potential vulnerability and that you are creating a scenario where somebody might want to come in and, take advantage of you. So you want to make sure that your administrator account has a strong password. You want to make sure that your network settings, and typically they're saying right here, such as a static IP address, are configured. And we've done that, right? We configured a static IP address. And the reason you want to be static is because if you are going to provide a significant role out in your network, you don't want to be a moving target. And then the third thing is making sure that you have all your security updates up to date for the same reason I was mentioning before about the administrator password. Make sure you're secure. I happen to know that all 3 of these things have been done for this server, and they will be maintained for this server at all points going forward. And that's why I'm saying go ahead and skip this page in the future. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Next. Now I get to choose whether this is a role or feature-based installation, which is exactly what we're doing because we're configuring a single server by adding roles, role services and features. Okay, we're going to actually add a role. Or we could do a remote desktop services installation if this was more of a VDI environment that we were working with. Not something we're going to get into here in this course right now. Okay, so it's going to be a role-based installation. I'll click Next. I need to select the server in which we are going to install the role. Remember that everything in Server Manager is designed to be done either locally or remote. It really doesn't matter. Okay, it's so when just because I'm on this particular computer in the Server Manager doesn't mean that it's this server that I want to be updating. Now in this case, you'll notice that really it's the only server I have, right? I mean, New York DC1 is the only one that I've created at this point. So yes, that is the server that we're going to install it on. I'll click Next. I should mention, by the way, on that previous page, if we had a list of servers that we were managing from this one location, we would see that list, and we could very easily install the role on any of those servers. It wouldn't have to be on the local server that we're on. Now, it's on this page that we get to choose the actual role that we're going to install. And if you look up here, you'll see Active Directory, Domain Services. So I'm going to check the box and watch what happens when I do. Automatically, if there are any additional roles and features that are needed to support the role that you're installing. In the old days, you just get an error message saying, you know what, you can't install this role because you need some other stuff. And you don't have that stuff. So go fix it. It was kind of annoying because then you'd go and fix it and then you'd hope you did everything you needed to and then you come back and try again. Well, now it just prompts you and says, you need all this other stuff. And if I want to go ahead and add this stuff automatically right now, I just go ahead and click Add Feature. So I'll click that button right now. Now, I can't really see that anything has changed, but if I click Next, and the next thing here is where we can add features, you'll notice that there are certain things like Group Policy Management where the box has already been checked for me. So I love the fact that you no longer have to go back and install stuff manually yourself. Microsoft has now built these wizards to automatically look and say, you need something else, so let me install it for you. So I'll go ahead and click Next because there's no other features that I want to install. Here's just a basic overview of what ADDS is, right? Active Directory Domain Services. I understand what it is, so I'll click Next. And here's just a confirmation of everything that's going to be done. You'll see there's a checkbox here for restart the destination server automatically if required. I'm going to check that box, and I get a little warning saying, hey, if the restart's required, the server is going to restart automatically without additional notification. Are you sure you want to do this? And I'm going to say yes. Now in this case, it's easy because I'm on the local server, and who cares? I'm installing. If it reboots, it reboots. We're golden. But if you were doing this remotely, and that's the one thing you're going to hear me, it's like I'm beating a dead horse. If you're, everything's about remote management. If you're remotely installing this on another server, you have to keep in mind that if other people are also looking at that server, their work may be interrupted because you told it to go ahead and install a role and then reboot automatically when it was done. All right, so that's why that box is there, and that's why the warning comes up. Now from there, I'm going to go ahead and click Install. And you'll see here that it is beginning the installation process. Now, one very significant thing that I want to show you is right here. It says that you can close this wizard without interrupting running tasks. Okay, so you can view the task process or open this page again by clicking Notifications in the command bar and then Task Details. In other words, the Close button is actually highlighted. It is available. I can click it, close this window. I don't have to sit here and stare at this while it's doing its thing. Now that said, because we have nowhere else to go, we have nothing else to do, I am going to go ahead and let this finish. And depending on how long this takes, through the magic of video technology, I'll speed it up a little bit so that you're not staring at it too long. And then we will continue as soon as it's done. Okay. I can see that it has completed, and I know this because, first of all, the bar has gone all the way across the screen. It does tell me here configuration is required, but installation has succeeded on NYDC1. Now you'll notice that right here is where it's telling me that there are additional steps. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this link to promote this server to a domain controller. When I click on that link, you'll see here that the Active Directory Domain Services Configuration Wizard opens. Now let me go ahead and pull this box down. And I'm just pulling it down so we can see it a little better here in the middle of the screen. You will see that on the very first screen here, we have to choose whether we are adding a domain controller to an existing domain, adding a new domain to an existing forest, or adding a new forest. And before we get into this, there's some terminology that I'd like to go over with you. Okay, I mean, for instance, we're talking about forests here. We don't know what a forest is yet. So let's step away from this installation for just a moment. Let me explain some of the Active Directory Domain Services terminology, and then we'll come right back. So first, I'd like to talk to you about the logical components of Active Directory Domain Services. And the first one I have listed here is something called a forest. Okay? And a forest is a collection of one or more Active Directory domains. Now, that may or may not be clear to you because you may not know what a domain is yet, but we'll talk about that in a minute. But you'll have many of these different domains that share a common logical structure, something called the directory schema, which we'll also talk about, directory configuration, and global catalog. Basically, the easiest way to just simplify what a forest is it's one instance of Active Directory Domain Services. Now, you may have more than one forest within an organization. There are certain reasons that you may need to break apart those instances. And one reason would be security. Very often, forests are considered to be security boundaries, okay, because all of the users and groups and all the various objects within a single forest and all of the permissions that go with those objects stay within the forest unless you explicitly configure one forest to actually cooperate and communicate with another forest. That's taking us kind of out of the scope of where we're at right here. Okay, so a forest is that one overall instance of Active Directory Domain Services. Now, a tree is something that you didn't see on that previous screen that we were just looking at, but a tree is a collection of domains, just like a forest is, but it's specifically a collection of domains that share a common DNS namespace. Now, I used to always say that a tree was a grouping of domains that was structured in a hierarchical fashion, sharing contiguous namespace. It's the same definition. The idea is that you have these domains and they are hierarchical. So you might have one domain that is called globalmantics.local. Okay, so that could be the name of a domain. But then you might have another domain that is northamerica.globalmantics.local. Okay, and that's what we mean by hierarchical. In other words, we've now gone one more level out when it comes to DNS naming. And if you're not familiar with DNS naming and how it all works, there is a lesson in this course on DNS, and it's very important that you do understand DNS name structures. Okay, so please, even if you need to stop here and go watch that lesson, go ahead and do it. Otherwise, just go ahead and continue through, and when you get to that lesson, it'll make a lot more sense. So it's hierarchical, and then of course we're sharing that DNS namespace in the sense that they both are globalmantics.local. Okay, and we can even go deeper into that. Into that tree, we could have globalmantics.local. Down from there, we could have northamerica.globalmantics.local. Down from there, we could have a domain called sales.northamerica.globalmantics.local. Now, the third one I have on the list here is a domain. And I just mentioned, that term domain, we've already seen that in both the other definitions. A domain is that core administrative unit of Active Directory Domain Services. In other words, that's what we're creating here. It's that core administrative unit of stuff, of objects. And when we say core administrative, we're saying it's the higher level of overall management of a common group of objects. They all go into the same domain. Now, within that domain, and speaking of administration, we have something called organizational units, or just OU, you'll see all the time. And an OU is a container within a domain, really. I have it listed as within Active Directory Domain Services, but you'll see these containers within domains, and those containers are going to provide really three things. I have two things listed here. I say it's a framework for administration and group policy links. And administration is the one that could be broken apart into two different things. Before I get to that, let me first address that it says group policy links. Group policy is something that we will learn about in some later lessons, and I say that in plural because group policy is more than just one lesson. There's a lot of things that make up group policy, and you will see that group policies, the way you make certain users or groups get affected by these group policies is by putting them in these containers in an organizational unit, or you link the group policy to that organizational unit. And as far as the administration, there's two components of it. You have the delegation of privileges over certain objects, right? You have delegation of the management of objects, and you can do that by delegating out permissions over an organizational unit. But then we also have the other side of administration, which is just making things look organized, right? Just having things structured in a way that you can find them fairly easily. Now, the next item on the list here is a site. And it's funny because a site is something that I typically in the past used to be included on the physical side, not the logical side of Active Directory domain services. And it's kind of been up for debate. The reason I have it on the logical side is because it's a collection of Active Directory objects, meaning it's logically part of Active Directory domain services. In other words, we can create these sites logically, but what they represent is all of these objects defined by their physical location, and that's why sometimes we call the site some of the physical components of Active Directory is because it represents something physical. But the reality is that a site is a logical item within Active Directory. Now, the schema is something that was mentioned before. We will have one schema per forest. And the schema, I'm not going to go into any detail here. It defines all the attributes for all objects in Active Directory. In other words, if a user object in Active Directory says that it has an attribute for the user's first name, it has an attribute for the last name, it has an attribute that they have a password, it has an attribute that they have a phone number, this is all defined by the schema. Okay, so that's what the schema is. And the last logical component we have here is a partition. And a partition, just as it would be like when you partition a hard drive, right? You have one physical hard drive, but you can partition it into logical drives. It's the same thing here with the Active Directory database. The database is actually contained in a single file. But partition means that that one file is partitioned into many different logical areas. Now let's talk about the physical components of Active Directory domain services. The first one, this is an easy one, domain controllers. That's what we're doing right now. We are creating a domain controller. And what does that mean? That means that this computer is going to have a copy of the Active Directory domain services database. Okay, it is going to be responsible for hosting that database and is going to be available to provide Active Directory domain services to the clients. The data store, as I just mentioned a moment ago, we talked about partition. The data store is the physical file, the actual file you will find on the domain controller that stores that database. It stores all the objects, all the Active Directory domain services information. A global catalog server, which we're going to see in just a moment when we go through the wizard, we'll see the option for these last two, global catalog and read-only domain controllers. A global catalog server, I love the definition here. It's a domain controller that hosts the global catalog. Great. What's the global catalog? It's a partial read-only copy of all the objects in the forest. It's kind of like the yellow pages for everything in the entire forest. Okay, there's one global catalog throughout the forest, and the global catalog servers are the ones that actually host that catalog. Then we have read-only domain controllers, which really, I put it there because we're going to see it, but it's really no different than a domain controller other than the fact that, well, it's a special read-only copy. And we do that so that, let's say we're out in a branch office and there's not a lot of security there. You may want to increase security by making the domain controller read-only, which means it can service the clients, but changes cannot be made to your database. All right, so now that we know the makeup and the terminology of all of this Active Directory stuff, let's pop back over to the actual operating system and the wizard that we're in the middle of installing. Okay, so back here at our installation, now that we know all the different terminology, we need to take a look at what we want to do. Now, this is kind of interesting. This is one very subtle change that the Active Directory team made in Windows Server 2012 that just kind of shows what Microsoft was trying to accomplish, some of the things they were looking to do when they created this environment. There are certain stupid, silly, little, trivial things that have been around for a long, long time, and we've all gotten used to it, but yet it really was no big deal to change, so they figured, well, why don't we go ahead and implement some of these changes? And one of them can be seen right here on this very first screen. When you think about your Active Directory infrastructure, if you had, let's say, 100 domain controllers that you were going to create, how many of those domain controllers are you most likely going to be, when going through this wizard, are you going to be selecting add a new forest? Now, the answer doesn't have to be what I'm about to say, but typically it's going to be close. Okay, and the answer is 1. Okay, it's that simple. One domain controller is going to be the beginning of the whole forest. Now, the reason I say that's not necessarily true is because there are certain enterprise environments where you will have multiple forests, but even in those environments, each of those forests, you're only creating that new forest once. And then from there, how often are you adding a new domain into that existing forest? Well, you're only doing that once for each domain that you create in the forest. And then every other domain controller that you are installing, what you're doing is you're adding a domain controller to an existing domain. So the feedback from administrators is that 90+% of the time, when we're running through this wizard, the choice that I make is add a domain controller to an existing domain. So look what Microsoft did. They made that the default setting. And I will tell you that that's the first time that it's been the default setting since the inception of Active Directory. Okay, if you go all the way back to Windows 2000, every version, when you installed Active Directory, the default setting was add a new forest. And you had to, 90% of the time, change it to add a domain controller to an existing domain. Now, the reason I point this out is not because I'm overly impressed with this one thing, because I mean, how hard was it just to click one little button here and change that? It's not hard at all. It's the point that there's a lot of these subtleties throughout the operating system that Microsoft has paid attention to. Okay, it's just some of the detail that they're finally paying attention to that we've all been crying out for years. So I think that's a great thing. Now, even though I just finished telling you that 90+% of the time we're going to be adding a domain controller to an existing domain, well, this particular domain controller, because it is the very first one we're installing, guess what? We're adding a new forest. We're doing that one that used to be the default. All right, so I'm going to click on that button there, and then I need to give it a domain name. What is the beginning of this forest going to be called? And we are going to call it Globomantics, right? That's the name of the company, .local, because this is not going to be an external web presence. That would be globomantics.com. This is going to be an internal Active Directory name, so we do globomantics.local. That's not a requirement, but it is a strong recommendation to keep that separated for security and administrative purposes. I'll go ahead and click Next. What it does here is it's actually looking at the name. It goes out there to look at the name and make sure that it's not in use on your network, as well as it's also out there looking at the NetBIOS version of the name, which is going to just simply be Globomantics, and make sure that it's not in use. All right, from here, it's now asking me to set the functional level of our forest and domain. Now these functional levels, if I pull down the drop box, you will see we have a choice going all the way back to Windows Server 2003. That's as far back as I can go with these functional levels. But here's the deal. You set your domain and forest functional levels based upon however far back you are going to still have installed and support previous operating systems. And this is only on your domain controllers. Okay, member servers don't matter. So specifically for your domain controllers, if you know you're going to have a Windows Server 2003 domain controller, then you go back and you set your forest back to 2003. If you know that you're going to have 2008 or 2008 R2 domain controllers, then you set it back there. And if you know that you're only going to have Windows Server 2012 and newer, then you leave it there. Now, the one thing that Microsoft did do is they separated functionality from the domain and forest functional levels. And by the way, when you're wondering what the difference is between the domain functional level and the forest functional level, it has to do with, well, all the domain controllers in the domain for the domain functional level and all the domain controllers in the forest for the forest functional level. Okay? Now, in the old days, it had to do with functionality. In order to support those older domain controllers, you had to put it to the older functional level so that it would only have the limited functionality of those older domain controllers so they would know how to work in your environment. The easy answer is here, because I feel like I'm kind of, just kind of spinning you in circles here with these functional levels. The real simple answer is, what is the oldest domain controller that you're going to have in any given domain, and set the functional level to support that. And you'll notice that I can only choose 2012, and the reason is because the forest is set to 2012. If in the entire forest, and I guess that's the first place you should look, what is the oldest domain controller that you're going to support? If it's, let's say, 2003, you set your forest there. And then in this domain, is this one of the domains that's going to have to also support 2003? Or maybe this domain only goes back as far as 2008 or 2008 R2, or maybe this domain's only going to have Windows Server 2012. Okay, that's the long and the short of it. Now that said, I'm going to set these both at Windows Server 2012 because that's all I'm going to be playing with here in this environment. Then we have to specify other domain controller capabilities like being a DNS server. Very good idea to go ahead and let your Active Directory domain controllers also be DNS servers, because you need DNS in order to support Active Directory functionality. And using what's called Active Directory integrated DNS is a really good idea from a functionality, an administrative, and from a security perspective. Okay, so it's a good idea to leave that checked. The next box is grayed out, and it's checked, but I can't uncheck it, and that is, do I want to be a global catalog? You have to have at least one global catalog server, and since this is the first domain controller being installed, it has to be a global catalog server. There is no choice. The global catalog is used to help with searching through Active Directory. Okay, so that searching functionality, it's like a yellow pages for everything in Active Directory. And the last option here is read-only domain controller, which again is grayed out, and it's not checked. And the reason is because in order to have a read-only domain controller, which we will learn about in a later lesson, you have to first have a fully functional read-write domain controller in place. And since, again, this is the first one, I can't be read-only. On this page, the next thing is to go ahead and type in a Directory Services Restore Mode password. Let me go ahead and type that in here. This is a secure password that you will use to get into Directory Services Restore Mode, which we'll learn more about in Backup and Recovery. I'll click Next. From here, we get a warning about a delegation for this DNS server cannot be created because the authoritative parent zone cannot be found. Okay, and the reason is because, well, if we're going to use globalmantics.local, what it's saying is I can't find a DNS server for just .local. And we know that because this is an internal only. There is no .local DNS server. I am creating the forest root. So that's an acceptable error. Again, I shouldn't use the word error. I should say warning. We're okay with that. All right, so we're just going to click Next, pass that warning. This is where it's actually checking the NetBIOS name that I was mentioning earlier. That's checking the DNS name, and then it's also checking the NetBIOS name. This is where it's checking the NetBIOS name, and you'll see that it populates globalmantics. Okay, this is to support backward compatibility to older NetBIOS name functionality for anything that doesn't use DNS.
Hello.
I'll click Next.
Hello.
Here we get to choose the path of where our database
Hello.
will be stored, our log files will be stored, and where the sysfile share will be stored. In my case here, I'm going to take the defaults because this particular computer only has a single hard drive, right? When we installed it, we just had that single 200 gig hard drive that it was created as all one partition. It's just our C drive. So I'll take the defaults. But in a production environment, you may want to do things like separate the database and log files into separate physical hard disks so that you can get better performance. Click on Next. And here's where we get to review everything that we're doing. And before I go any further, there is something I have to show you here. If you think back to the PowerShell introduction lesson that I had done, and I talked to you about how there will be certain places in the operating system where you will be able to see the PowerShell script that's making a certain action that you're taking in the GUI take place? Well, here's an example of that. If I click on View Script, boom, it opens up a simple text document, right? It's just a simple notepad that shows me that these are the actual PowerShell commands that are being implemented to make this all happen. And from here, I could save this and then use this as a script for other Active Directory installations. So let's say I had a couple other forests that I wanted to create. I could take this script, change the domain and the domain net BIOS name. Okay, just change those two things to support some other forest that I'm going to create. And if I want everything else to be the same, I can just take this in the form of a script, run it in PowerShell, and Active Directory gets installed. All right, so let's get out of PowerShell. Just wanted to show you that real quick. I'm going to click on Next, and I love this next step because this next step is it's going through a prerequisite check. I love it. It is checking right here, right now to say, can this computer truly become a domain controller? Because again, in the old days, we used to just start the process. And if there was a problem, it would just error out. And then we had to figure it out. Sometimes we'd have to cancel out of everything, fix the problem, figure out what's going on, and then install again. Well, now it's going to check before installing, so you don't have to waste all that time. I love it. Now again, this process will take a different amount of time depending on all the specifics of your computer and what resources are available and so on and so forth. Okay, but as you can see, mine has finished here. And there's a couple things I want to point out. First of all, the part that's just kind of staring you right in the face, right here in the box, which is where your eyes tend to want to go, you see all these warnings, and you think, uh-oh, this is a problem. But before we worry about that, I want to point out up at the top here, we get this green checkbox. All prerequisite checks passed successfully. Click Install to begin installation. Yeah, that's cool. If I want, I can ignore these because this right here is telling me I'm good to go. I could click Install. But I do see warnings, so you know what? Maybe I should actually pay attention. What do I get here? I get a warning telling me about a certain setting with cryptography for Windows NT4. Okay, so I'm not going to worry about it because I'm not working with that old stuff, but this is a potential problem, and it tells you the knowledge base article you could go to if this was a security issue for your environment. And then the second warning we've already seen before, which is the delegation for the DNS server. We already know that that's true, and we know why. It tells me that all prerequisite checks were completed and it was passed successfully and to begin installation. So, one other little warning here. If you click Install, the server will automatically reboot. Again, just letting you know, hey, you might want to be aware of that. So I'm going to click Install, and it's on its way. And you'll notice that as it's going through, we're going to see these warnings again as we go through the installation. Here's the warning about the security setting, and then in just a little bit here, we'll see another warning come up about the DNS delegation. But it's going to go through and complete the installation. And as part of this, I will tell you that it's going to reboot. It's going to look a little bit awkward on here because when it reboots, because I'm on a remote desktop connection, it's just going to kill the remote desktop connection. So I'll just lose that connection. Once it's done rebooting, I can go ahead and reestablish that connection and log back in. So again, through the magic of video, we're going to go ahead and speed this up for you. But if you are following along, feel free to pause the lesson and let your computer catch up to me. Okay, so as you can see, it has completed the installation process. We got all the messages about rebooting, and then as I mentioned what happened, it just kind of blanked out on us because it was a remote desktop connection, so you lose that connection when it reboots. So what we're looking at here is my host computer, and here I have a shortcut to NYDC1 as far as that remote desktop connection. So let me reconnect back in, and hopefully the reboot has completed, which will allow us to get back in. It looks like it because it made a connection. You'll notice the credentials are not working, and I don't want to log in as NYDC1 administrator anymore because it's not just a member server anymore. It's now a domain controller. So I'm going to tell it to use another account to log in, and I'm going to put in Globomantics, right? That's the name of the domain, /administrator. Okay, I'm logging in as the domain administrator. Put in my password, click OK, and hope that we can make a connection. And it looks good so far. And here we see we get to the desktop for NYDC1. And as is always the case, when you first log into a computer, it jumps over into the server manager, which is a good thing, right? Because that's where we were anyway, right? We were in the server manager installing the role. As I mentioned before, don't worry about the fact that immediately after the reboot, certain things turn red, right? Especially if it's saying that its services are your issue. I mean, I guess I'll point out to you real quick while this is loading up. If I click on services, this is one of the things I love about Server Manager. It turns red, it shows you why, and then you just click on it and it'll tell you exactly why. It tells me that there are 3 services. They're currently stopped. But notice that the start type is set to automatic with a delayed start. So we pretty much know. We say, all right, you know what? We know that these services are supposed to be running, but they have a delayed start. Let me go ahead and cancel out of here, which means that these are eventually going to start and the error is going to go away. As a matter of fact, sometimes you can come up here and just click refresh. And I don't know if it'll work this time. Oh, it did. Sometimes you can just click refresh a moment later and now the services have started. If the services had not started, or if the error doesn't go away and let's say 10-15 minutes has gone by or some significant amount of time, then you can go in and start manually starting up those services and well, you start troubleshooting and go from there. All right, well guess what? We've done it. We've installed Active Directory Domain Services on NYDC1. And we know this because here in the Server Manager, you'll see we have ADDS. You'll notice under the Tools menu, we now have a bunch of Active Directory tools plus Group Policy Management. These are all things that we're going to look at in later lessons. We can also tell that down here, we have an actual role for ADDS, and it's showing that we have a server in there. So that's pretty much it. That's how you install Active Directory Domain Services. Now, the one thing that I want to do real fast before we wrap up this lesson is, let me go ahead and I'm actually going to minimize NYDC1. And I am going to jump into a remote desktop connection that I have for NYDC2. Now, this is another Windows Server 2012 computer that I have created. This is nothing that I showed you as part of the course. So that's what I'm telling you right now. And actually, to be more specific, this is just another computer with Windows Server on it. If I jump into Server Manager, we'll take a look at it. I want to show you all the specifics so that if you are following along and if you want to have everything just like I have it here, well, then you'll be able to go ahead and set yours up the same way. Here in the Server Manager, what we want to do is jump over to our local server. And I will show you that the settings are, that the way I've set this up is pretty much the same as how NYDC1 was, in the sense that the name obviously is NYDC2 instead of 1. It's just part of a work group. Everything else here is configured exactly the same, with the only exception being that the IP address, I gave it 192.168.10.202 instead of 201. Okay, I have to give it static IP because it's going to be a domain controller, but it needs to be a separate, different IP than the first domain controller. And if I jump back over here to the dashboard, the reason I named it NYDC2 is because this is going to be an additional domain controller for the domain. In an enterprise environment, you never want to have, but I won't even say enterprise, in any environment, you want to try to avoid having only one domain controller. Even in a smaller business, if you have the means to have a second domain controller, please go ahead and do it. So I'm going to add roles and features. Notice that I do get this before you begin, even though we checked that box saying don't bother me with this, and that's because we're now on a different computer. And I'm just going to click through this very quickly. It's all the same steps. ADDS says there's some features, so I'll add those features. Next, next, next. Go ahead and reboot if you have to. Yes, and install. Okay, it's all the same steps that we did before. It's going to take just a moment for this to go through. Once this is done, I'm going to jump into the Active Directory installation, or really I should say the Active Directory configuration wizard, and all I'm going to do differently, and I'll go ahead and show you. We'll speed this up just so that we can get through this and wrap up this lesson. But all I'm going to do is I'm going to say that I want to be an additional domain controller in an existing domain. And I'm doing this so that along the way here, as we're working with all this, if something happens to NYDC1, well, we'll have NYDC2 as a backup, so to speak. We'll have a little redundancy built in to our Active Directory infrastructure. So let me go ahead and let this install, and then we'll get this done and we'll wrap up the lesson. Okay, that part has completed. I'm now going to click Promote this server to a domain controller. And this time, we are going to add a domain controller to an existing domain, the default. Here it wants me to specify a domain for this operation. Oh, you know, there is one other thing I should show you. Let me click back to our server manager for just a moment. If I come over here to the local server and look at our IP configuration, this is very, very important. People run into this problem all the time. We've seen that we gave it a different IP address. Right? We know that we gave 192.168.10.202, same subnet mask, same gateway. We want to point to that first domain controller as a preferred DNS server. And the reason why is because I told you that DNS is needed to support Active Directory. In order for this computer to even be able to recognize the fact that the other domain controller exists, it has to have a DNS server to tell it that. So if we only pointed to 192.168.10.1 for internet reasons, that DNS server is not necessarily going to know about Active Directory. Okay? The first domain controller, because we made it a DNS server as well, it wrote some records to itself to be able to share with everybody else. This is a big, big problem that both the domain controller and then anybody who wants to join the domain or become an additional domain controller, they have to also point to the same DNS server. So let me back out of all of this. Let's jump back over here to our Active Directory Domain Services Configuration Wizard. If I click on Select for the domain, and I go ahead and put in credentials, right? So I'm going to say Globomantics Administrator, right? I need to put in credentials of somebody who actually can see this domain. And right now I'm just logged in as a local administrator. Click OK. It's retrieving the domains that are available in the forest. And you'll see here, it then says to select the domain that you want to go ahead and, well, become a part of. So I'll click globomantics.local, click OK. It populates that in. You'll notice now that the credentials default to the Globomantics administrator because I already put them in. You have to have the correct administrative privileges to do this. Obviously, the built-in administrator can. Click Next. Here I get to choose if I want to also be a DNS server, which I am. If I'm going to be truly redundant to the other domain controller, I want to do all the same things. So I do want to be a DNS server. You'll notice this time I now have a choice of being a global catalog server or not. I'm again going to say yes because I want to be completely redundant. And I also have the choice of being a read-only domain controller if I want to be. And I don't because I want to be completely redundant. But I just want to show you that those aren't grayed out anymore because this is the second domain controller. I have to choose what site I'm going to belong to. Sites is something that we will cover in a different place, but it has to do with what location you are a part of. And I will tell you that the first domain controller became a part of a site called Default First Site Name. That's the only site we have right now, so we're going to join that same site. We have our DSRM password, so let's put that in again. We get the same warning here about DNS. We already know why that is in place. Click Next. Now this is where I can choose to specify an IFM option where we install from media. And this has to do with if we were connected over a really slow WAN link, right? Let's say I'm installing a domain controller in a whole different office and I need to replicate the Active Directory database. We can actually export it out to media. We can export it out to USB or a DVD or whatever we want to put it out to, and we can send it. We could literally, snail mail, FedEx, whatever we want to do. We can ship it over to that other office and install from media. But we're not going to, in this case, we're just going to go ahead and replicate from any other domain controller. And you'll see here, or I could tell it replicate from New York DC1. Doesn't matter which way I leave it because there's only one to replicate from. In the real world, you would pick one if there was a replication issue. If you knew there were multiple domain controllers and you knew one was closer to you than another, you may want to specify instead of having it happen automatically. I'll click Next, take our default paths because again we just have one hard drive on this computer. Review everything, click Next. It's going to go through and do a prerequisite check. It's going to pass all the prerequisites with the same warnings that we had before. We're going to go ahead and tell it to install. There they are. You see the same warnings, but everything completed and passed. We click Install, and it's on its way. Okay, it's going to install. It's going to reboot. As part of that reboot, I'm going to get kicked out. And I'm not going to waste your time having to watch this process. So I'm going to wrap up the lesson and bring us to the end here while this is installing. But I do want you to go ahead and get that second domain controller completed on your end as well. And so that does bring us to the end of this lesson, where you now know how to install Active Directory domain services. And there's a couple of main things before we end this lesson. And number one, keep in mind the importance of Active Directory domain services. It is all of the directory services for your environment, which means Active Directory, as we'll learn in upcoming lessons, really has control over access to pretty much everything in any environment bigger than, let's say 10 computers. And very often these days, even in your smaller networks, you're going to have it. And then the second thing is, and I know I just mentioned this a moment ago, but please take the time to go in and play around and install additional domain controllers and play with the different settings that we saw when installing Active Directory domain services. But other than that, that's it. I'll see you in the next lesson.